Hi, I'm Wes Rehberg, author, and one of my books is Opening the Gate, a collection of short stories, these, which I consider the work of a brazen, white-haired neophyte, efforts that I hope engage the soul as well as the mind of a reader, and as well convey the spirit of the content I had in mind when I set out to put in words what's within. And I hope this is the case. This is a collection of short stories and poems, a few of which have been published in other venues, literary magazines. This one that I'll read from is not one of those. It's called The Fog. The fog. Enoch felt secure in its midst. It muted city sounds. It was a cloak that left him with the sensation that he was connected with a visible spirit, yet separate, suspended. Sitting on a bench near a subway station in lower Manhattan, he thought back to a decisive day in his young life, another morning in the fog, when he walked down a Queens street to a candy store. Very similar, he thought. Then he was 12, now he's 17. He had always seemed to himself out of place. True, he played with others, then stickball in the schoolyard, punchball, stoopball, roller hockey on the streets, was good at it. But there was a division between all this and him that he wasn't able to fathom. Maybe it's my name, he remembered himself thinking while walking in the fog that day down narrow 208th Street in Queens to the store. Enoch Jewball. Some his age called him Jewboy. Actually, he could have argued that his Hungarian-born grandfather was Catholic, his grandmother a Lutheran, and he was confirmed in the Catholic Church. His grandfather had an Austrian named Rothpower, but his drinking buddies called him Rummy. "Rummy Jewboy," the young boys said, teasing, when Enoch let on about his grandfather's name. These 2 days in the fog meshed. He barely noticed people's haste as they exited and entered the subway stair near him. Back then, he recalled, a wisp of mist had risen from a manhole cover toward him as he walked, with a sewer scent. He remembered letting himself feel enveloped by it. Now it was the musty odor from the underground, from up the subway. It, too, enveloped him. Nah, it was just me, he thought. Musing, he recollected hearing a boy's voice call to him in the fog as he neared a corner on his walk. "Enoch! Hey! Up here!" the boy called. It was Barry, a Jewish friend he sometimes hung out with, though Barry's mother didn't approve. Barry had climbed a tree. "Where you going?" "Down to Dink's." "Yeah, okay, I can't go. My mother wants me to stay around. Give me a candy bar, will you, baby? A baby Ruth." "You got any money?" "A quarter." Barry tossed it onto the sidewalk. "Okay, I'm keeping the change. Don't fall," Enoch said. This was just a year after the end of World War II, which he had followed in the newspapers from 3rd grade on, remembering Franklin D. Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech on the radio, after Japanese planes bombed Pearl Harbor. He had also followed the first atomic bomb tests at Alamogordo, New Mexico, and Bikini Atoll, reading about the concern that a nuclear chain reaction from the explosions could uncontrollably erupt throughout the world. And then there were the A-bomb devastations of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He remembered experiencing, too, the brown B-47s flying low overhead in Queens en route to the war, the air raid drills and the blackouts, VE Day when the Allies finally defeated Hitler's armies and neighborhood people ran out into the night to celebrate with shouts, banging pots and pans, and VJ Day when Japan surrendered and the neighbors celebrated again, except those who had the little flag in a window of their house or apartment that indicated someone in their family was killed in battle. It was always a curiosity on the street to see a new flag up. "Look, Enoch!" a neighborhood boy, Kirk, had said when the war was nearing its end as they walked along 33rd Avenue. "There's another one. Isn't that where one of the teachers lives?" Enoch remembered asking. "Mrs. O'Brien?" "Yeah, and her son Denny," Kirk answered. "He always acted like he was a big shot." It was also a time he knew in his newspaper reading, a time of anticipation of the Korean conflict that again would take thousands of military lives. He'd be too young for that one when it came, just by a hair. Now it was over. Though beginning to fail in school then, he read the newspapers and kept up on the war news, thinking it didn't make sense to him, especially the casualties, the atrocities, the Holocaust. He read sports news as well, the heroics, the statistics about the players, and collected baseball cards that would eventually disappear at home. Homework was out of the question for him in the rented 3 rooms he had shared with his mother, brother, and grandparents upstairs in a 2-family house, especially the times when his grandfather came home drunk and he'd be manhandled, once even picked up and thrown against the wall, shoved repeatedly against the refrigerator. It was supposed to toughen him up. Occasionally he'd be sent by bicycle to a corner tavern in Bayside West to tell his grandfather it was time to come home, which he both dreaded and looked forward to as a challenge. On the bench, Enoch smiled at how that encounter would go. "Pops, Grandma wants you. Better get in your car and come home," he'd say. "Look who's got the balls to tell me what to do," his grandfather would reply, something like that. "Get your ass out of here. You're as stupid as your father." Then his grandfather would laugh, more like a cackle, turn his back, and drink his shot and beer. Times with his grandfather became worse after the war when his job ended at the Farmingdale, Long Island plant that built P-47 Thunderbolt fighter planes. It would be a couple of humiliating years before he'd find working again, ending up as a machinist in a paper goods factory in Queens. His grandmother was drinking heavily, too, usually loopy by supper time. An evening ritual for Enoch was to feel the radiator of his grandfather's faded black Dodge parked on the street. If it was warm, he'd still be up. Not a good time to go in. His younger brother Jimmy was occasionally hovering nearby. "Still warm," Jimmy said one time, he remembered. "Where you been?" "Around, in the park for a while. Mom's not home?" "No, late bus hasn't come yet." Enoch's mother, Ann, was the mainstay support during that difficult period, with her job as a film hand at Paramount Studios in Manhattan. His father, Seth, lived alone in Manhattan in a small midtown hotel on 9th Avenue, a brooding freelance illustrator who had been blacklisted because of union organizing at a magazine. With him there was little contact and no financial support, and Enoch usually only saw his younger brother at home. There was little exchange between them beyond that. In the fog, then and now, Enoch wondered why he felt so confusingly separate. He thought about how he hated to fight when challenged by other boys. When he wouldn't, they'd hoot and call him chicken shit. He wouldn't steal candy bars at Dinks either as challenged, though he began to linger, not just to look at comics, but also women's shapes in magazines, feeling a growing sensation in his body. "You gonna buy one of those?" Jim Dinks on his walk then. "No, just the paper," he replied. It was usually the Daily Mirror with photos, though sometimes he bought the Herald Tribune and slipped a magazine inside when Dinks was preoccupied with other customers. He'd hide the magazine in the back of a billboard he sometimes crawled behind if there wasn't somebody homeless there. Enoch remembered first feeling that sensation in the neighborhood park when he was shinnying down the angled bars that held the swings upright. "Don't you ever do that again," his mother berated when he mentioned it to her. He was stung. Then he realized nobody told him. He thought, "Hell, you should talk." realizing even more, she propped up at night reading mysteries in a thin nightgown in her chair bed, while he and his brother went to sleep on a folded-down couch in the same room. He had discovered her notes about a married man named Bob from a diary she thought she kept hidden. He remembered becoming more acutely aware, too, of two girl neighbors along his street, of Noreen's laughing eyes and Dolores's coy smile, and their sinewyiness. He had daydreamed how he would rescue them from an onrushing car, and they'd love him, explore him, and he'd be connected. Dolores was the first to wear lipstick and began to flirt around. Noreen was athletic. The first one he deeply kissed and held, merged together in the dark alley between two houses, she in her sister's hand-me-down dress. Noreen also shared a cramped second-floor apartment in a two-family house with her sister and mother. In their living room window was one of the flags that indicated a war death in memory of her father. Enoch only knew Noreen's sister and mother to say hello. Then there were his escapes, like when he'd have enough small change to dare sneak off for a bus and subway excursion throughout the city. He knew the routes, or his frequent solitary bike rides to Crocheron Park over a wooden bridge above Cross Island Parkway to Little Neck Bay, locking the bike and walking along the sand's edge, the water polluted, yet gentle against the shore. He loved the edge. Days in school were meaningless, disconnected, abstract. Home was a wrench on his head. The streets were different. Then, as now, they were his refuge, his education. I should run away, he thought over and over then. It wouldn't take much. He didn't fear running away. He feared being caught and brought back again. That day, a little more than 4 years ago, coming out of Dinks, the fog drifted, broke up, and dissipated. If he could only disappear with it, he thought. Now I'm gone, he said to himself on the bench. He had formally quit school a year ago, obtained working papers, and gotten a job cleaning out meat lockers near the Hudson River waterfront, as well as a room in a small hotel in Lower Manhattan near Houston Street, a walk-up rooming house, really, with a bathroom at the end of the hall. It was noisy, but he didn't mind. The owner and others there were friendly, and the room was furnished. Better than the streets and the abandoned buildings he lived in, evading searches for his whereabouts, one among hundreds of city street kids working in the underground economy, the fish and produce markets, hawking newspapers for distributors, odd jobs, sometimes begging. He had seen and eluded his father and grandfather looking for him, both who knew the streets too. Enoch felt seasoned, savvy. Occasionally now, somewhat settled, he'd have lunch with his mother at a midtown automat restaurant, who pouted that he had run away. He'd hook up with his brother, too, who was still in school but who would take the bus and train to Manhattan. The two still lived with his grandparents and tried to persuade him to return. He declined. He couldn't imagine how they tolerated it. Sometimes he'd join his father for breakfast at a corner midtown luncheonette. Seth, ever brooding, but eking out a living. Enoch had passed on staying with him as well, now in another cramped hotel on 8th Avenue. Enough, he thought. Enoch rose from the bench, walked toward the Hudson River, a few blocks away. The fog was lifting. It was time for another decision. Noreen phoned the rooming house to tell him she was on her way to meet him. She'd be at Washington Square Park. Many times since running away, he had snuck into his old neighborhood to connect with her. Something between them persisted, more than the encounters that had grown more passionate each time they met. She was smart, had graduated from high school early, was ready to strike out, get a full-time job, maybe even look into going to City College of New York. Enoch couldn't figure out what she saw in him, but it didn't matter. He reached a wharf at the river's edge, kneeled on the planks, and looked into the water as it slapped against the pilings. Noreen said she was bringing a suitcase. A suitcase, he thought. He stood up, looked at the river, turned, grinned, and walked toward the park. Thanks for listening. This is Opening the Gate. To preview more about the stories within and the poetry, please go to www.wildclearing.com, and there you'll find a link to this book's page. Thanks.